Oldest favors of all. So, anyway, so. Easter.
Not at all a fraud, because they've already been raised and I said 6 years.
So, since we're combining,
Really?
Good afternoon, and welcome to the last and final panel for this year's conference. Just a reminder, we are combining the two sessions together. So we have 4 speakers in this last hour or so, and in order to leave room for questions and answers and interaction for the panel, I'm just going to go straight into inviting our first speaker. Dalia Fatmi will speak in Flux, U.S.-Egypt Strategic Interest and Military Relations Post-Arab Spring. And we are asking our speakers to have 10 minutes each, so we can have our conversation afterwards. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for still being here and halfway awake. So the title of the panel is U.S. Foreign Policy, Neoliberalism and Pact Theory, and Secretary Pompeo has just been confirmed, so part of me just wants to say good night, everybody. But, okay, let me walk through the rest of the talk. Since the Arab Spring and the call for democratic reform, we all know, especially after the last panel, that all but one state has become pretty authoritarian and repressive in nature. And so what I want to look at is the case of U.S.-Egypt relations in light of U.S. foreign policy and how it's changed in the region, from what was so-called democracy promotion to now the perceived just basic stability maintenance, and how U.S. aid was traditionally used to mitigate this, and even that game has changed. And so how when we think about U.S. foreign policy, especially towards Egypt, the question becomes, is it unclear? What is it exactly? But one strategy seems to dominate. It's that it's really better to get along with who's ever in power in order to continue some kind of security cooperation. And that's become the new paradigm of U.S. foreign policy. So when we think about Egypt and why we pay attention to it, it was Napoleon who said it's the most important country as the gateway both to Africa and the Middle East. But the way we also have come to look at Egypt, especially in terms of U.S. foreign policy, is having four primary interests. The first is maintenance of the Camp David Accords, U.S. military flyover rights, access to the Suez Canal, and more recently, anti-terrorism cooperation. And so Egypt, more than most other nations in the region, have this real interesting strategic importance to the United States. And so its stability has greater relevance to the way we think about regional stability, both militarily and ideologically. And so for decades, throughout various administrations, we've looked at how we actually negotiate this, engage this differently, in the names of securing our interests. And so the relationship between the U.S. and these post-Arab Spring states has never really been unidirectional. So if we look at post-2011 and the Arab uprisings, before the uprisings, the U.S. had reduced its military aid or its military presence, especially in Iraq, in terms of realignment on the war on terror, less military engagement. President Obama was moving his new administration into a foreign policy paradigm where diplomacy was going to lead. And in his 2009 inaugural address, he said, "To those who cling to power with corruption and deceit and the silencing of dissent, know that you are on the wrong side of history." And many of us have quoted this in our writing, signaling that it was going to be democracy that was going to be on the horizon. Add to that his Cairo speech and talking about a fresh start with the Muslim world. Little did he know that 2 years later, he was going to be recalibrating those very words at the United Nations, where he said, in terms of those commitments to democracy, the full force of the U.S. military was going to be behind what? Flyover rights, Sinai, counterterrorism, and all the other stuff, democracy promotion, human rights, that's where we could kind of negotiate. And so that happened within 2 years. And so it seems that the U.S. was taking a reactive approach, mitigating those rapid changes. And so when we think about the new perceived paradigm, even under President Obama, it was no longer about the democratic aspirations of people. Economic assistance, coordinating a stable exit strategy for dictators, by restraining and crumbling or contested regimes from turning violent, all of those started to become negotiated. And this type of paradigm shift was supposed to presumably both support U.S. ideals as well as interest in maintaining stability. And the mainstay of President Obama's initial foreign policy outlook. Now, Mubarak's era ended or signaled the decline of the regime's efficacy both domestically on its own population and in terms of its control of the military. And as I said earlier, and actually last night in another talk, at some point Mubarak became a liability to the military. And so here the question becomes, when there's military liability, how does the U.S. engage with that actor or with that player? During the transition moment, as the army was stepping in, this enormous influence in society was becoming apparent, but also was at the international level becoming apparent. How are army generals, who had worked very closely with the United States since 1979, through several peace treaties and different accords and different interests, direct recipients of military aid, how is that relationship going to be the gateway to the new mode of democracy? So if you have a long-standing military relationship, and now the military is basically in power, how are we going to talk about democratic aspirations, democracy promotions, and rethink even the language of U.S. foreign policy? And this is just in the interim time period. When the Islamist government of President Morsi is elected, the military relationship in Egypt still continued, but it was under this range of political issues that was going to test the friendship, test certain commitments. And although it lasted just 11 and a half months, the newly elected civilian president was going to supposedly rein power in from the military. And so when we're talking about reining power in from the military, how does U.S. strategic alliance with the military change? How do we start to ask those questions? How do they start to see it? Now, so this move established basically President Morsi in certain regards as a threat to the military government, the military relationship, and the U.S. finds itself in a position where you can't simultaneously hold military relations, Washington and Cairo relations, well, they're not necessarily the same. And so we started to see a kind of language around U.S. foreign policy that became duplicitous, right? And so we usually use that word to talk about other people, but here this word actually we have to rethink the way the language came about in terms of how we think about U.S. foreign policy. So, post-coup or post-coup and into the beginnings of the reign of President Sisi, we start to see Democratic support go back to the argument of let's just deal with the devil we know versus the devil we don't know. The devil we know is a military authoritarian dictator, if that's what it is, and the devil we don't know is a democratically elected leader that becomes pretty messy at some point. And so American strategy became seen as perceived through those two competing demands: the aspirations of the Arab people and the instability that might come from uprising versus the strategic interest that requires stability. And the cost of stability might be a new dictator. And this comes from the problem with which we have in the United States measured foreign policy interests. Is democracy and stability two sides of the same coin? Do we have to choose one or the other? Stability or democracy, democracy being unstable. And that's the language that was emerging, but for the first time, it became very, very clear. And so the U.S. responds at the time by suspending parts of the aid to Egypt. And so we started to see, for example, Secretary Kerry initially saying that there would be democratic preconditions that had to be met before military aid would be reinstituted. And what were the democratic preconditions? Parliamentary elections, presidential elections, and a new constitution. And the order was shifted, and then it didn't happen, and military aid was reinstituted again. And so we started to see is that even the kind of perceived commitments to the visibility or the visible preconditions of democracy were removed. And so the question becomes, yes, so in foreign policy we'd say it is a return to realpolitik, and that's okay. We are back into the realist paradigm. But for certain policy circles, this is not the only way forward. Abandoning the primacy of security concerns for political reform the argument has said has caused great insecurity. And so the road ahead has to rethink how we talk about strategic engagement. Egypt has such interests that historically have been perceived as if they're not that are not in keeping with U.S. interests, and so we use aid to mitigate it. For example, aid is seen as a mitigator of Camp David Accord, as if maintenance of Camp David or U.S. Egyptian Israeli interests are not actually in Egypt's interest, right? They actually are, and we saw that under the Morsi administration. So the belief that Egypt would even abandon these commitments misappropriates how we even think about Egypt's strategic goal in the region. And finally, we have been signaling a level of impunity to undemocratic actors in the region. And for several decades, this has been the case, but it's happening in a really interesting way today under President Trump. So, President Trump has said very interesting things, like when he had met President Sisi for the first time, of course, getting his phone call 3 days after he was elected, said that Sisi is a fantastic guy, even complimented the leader on his shoes. In turn, Sisi praises Trump for being a unique personality that is capable of doing the impossible. They embrace each other. This is not unusual, but when we start to see praise for authoritarian leaders around the world, talking about the backing of autocratic regimes has not just come back, but has come back almost with a vengeance, not just in Egypt and the Philippines, but in many other places. Last month, when Egyptians went to the poll, which we all know was a farce election, it was the President Trump who said that the people were now distinguished, and this is the actual call of the aspiration of the Egyptian people. Trump administration officials praised the vote, and even the American embassy in Cairo tweeted, "As Americans, we are very impressed with the enthusiasm and patriotism of Egyptian voters." And so here we go back to the signaling of different things to people and to the regime, but now we might not even be signaling anything to the Egyptian people. The democratic aspirations no longer matter. And so the irony, or my concluding statement comes to 5 points, is that the irony remains that people have historically questioned whether Islamists would use democracy to reach power and then end it. But what we're seeing today is that this question pertains to far more people, right? Where there are individuals, military leaders, using democracy to attain power and then will remain in power. And we know that President Sisi, for example, has just been re-elected in a sham election, but the Constitution will be amended for there to be an extension of term limits, and he will be president forever. And so the language of one man, one vote that we used to attribute to Islamists might need to extend to others. This is not going to be his last election. But again, going back to the United States and our relationship with them, Sisi has made some pretty interesting stumbles. In North Korea, for example, in Syria with Bashar al-Assad, with Putin on the nuclear deal. And yet, we haven't slapped his hand so much on those. We thought we did last summer in terms of the withholding of a part of the aid, and it was supposed to be under humanitarian reasons, but it was because of the nuclear, the relationship with North Korea. But Sisi has remained remarkably resilient in that regard, and when we think about Western strategy and the hope that he would moderate, or moderate his position on certain regards, this has proven to be a myth. And so it takes me back to this interesting thing that Churchill once commented upon. He said, appeasement is feeding a crocodile hoping it will eat you last. It's not clear what this administration in terms of Egypt is doing vis-a-vis the United States. Obviously, Egypt cannot hurt the United States in the sense of appeasement, but it has slapped us in the face a few times. It has done a couple of things that have not been in our strategic interest in a relationship with them. And so the question becomes, why do we play this game with them? Why do we allow them, or the Egyptian administration, to play this game with us? What has led to our lack of consistency, even in our language, in terms of the relationship with Egypt? We have for so long thought that there is no alternative for them except to engage with us. But why is it that we no longer leverage our power vis-a-vis a country like Egypt, knowing that they have no strategic ally in the region except for us? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Starting us off and with great insight on the issue of Egypt and U.S. relationships, we will now move to with Dean Abdelkader, who will speak on democratic transitions or their recipes for success.
Thank you for inviting me to talk today. My paper is also, in a way, about Egypt, even though it poses a larger question, really, as to how we can approach democratic transitions. So theoretically, in transitioning to democracy, rationalists, I'm a political scientist, so I do apologize, assume that either the masses or the elites bring about change. My paper hypothesizes that there is a causal relation between the actors involved in social change and the end product that is transitioning to democracy, whether it's from below or from above, is more likely to bring about democratic transition. So basically, I see the interplay between military powers and how relinquishing those powers to a civilian government will have implications for social movements theory and approaches to democratic transition. So when we talk about social movements in the Middle East, there are a lot of problems given that social movements and civil society organizations are oppressed and restricted with varying degrees in the region, and that they lack major political openings. It is particularly interesting in the field to observe and analyze how those societies operate through those restricted spaces to aspire and demonstrate for political rights. So the paper firstly is in total disagreement with what is called cultural exceptionalism as an explanation of social movements in the Arab Spring. In general, or in the Muslim world more broadly. That is to say, this is a middle-range approach which takes context as a central factor in understanding how informal networks in the Middle East and North Africa operate and how actors among them calculate when they do so. Second, theoretically, most modeling in comparative politics and political science as a whole is built on the global north, and therefore southern regions become the outliers in what is assumed to be the norm politically. What this comparative paper studies and emphasizes is that regional cases also could contribute to the classical questions of social mobilization and democratic transition theory. The global south also needs to theoretically be included in our studies of all things political. Contemporary politics are full of examples that currently prove that the universality of certain political concepts is challenged every day. It is time then to be inclusive of those experiences, to enrich our thin theories and recognize that comparative politics or democratic transition theories are not unilaterally defined. Third and last, it is important to note a problem that categories like nation, class, and even Islam have no quote-unquote objective existence or trans-historical essence. They are inherently problematic and should always be disaggregated, localized, and contextualized. Generalization then, or grand theory, becomes hazardous in capturing highly contested definitions such as Islam, democracy, and modernity. So I will now switch to change from above, and I will focus on the military institution. As an institution, the military in Egypt has exhibited power and economic existentialism. The military as a political player is also involved in regional politics as well as politics with the United States. It is important to address each one of those issues to establish the connections needed to prove or disprove my hypothesis. So first of all, I examine power. The relationship between the Egyptian army and its people is an intriguing one because although the army was repeatedly defeated over the years, images of gallantry and nationalism have consistently played a role in the Egyptian psyche. The army had control over all tools of propaganda to claim victory in each war that they lost, by controlling the media, the arts, and most importantly, education. So I go through all the 1967 war and then the 1973 war, and I will not list them here. So basically, the army's hold on power is so relentless that even Mubarak had to establish a strong police force in his attempt to hand over power to his civilian son Gamal Mubarak. Although Mubarak was part of the military, but his attempt to switch power to a civilian existentially threatened the military's power, and therefore SCAF was created, and the rest is history, as they say, with the elections of 2012 of the Muslim Brotherhood and what happened in 2013. The second issue that pertains to the military is the economy. It's the second linchpin or causal factor that affects the existential conflict and raison d'etre that the Egyptian military has in the country. In everything from housewares and military gear production to farming and tourism, the revenue from these enterprises goes straight to the military's coffers and is disbursed without state oversight. As Joshua Stacher put it, quote, "We're dealing with a brand new economy that's now run by military incorporated," end of quote. The U.S.-Egyptian military relationship is also an interesting one, and In March of 2014, General Lloyd Austin III, commander of U.S. Central Command, called Egypt an anchor, quote unquote, anchor state. In other words, Egypt is too important to let go no matter what happens inside it. The best proof of this statement is in the numbers. So in 2012, more than 2,000 U.S. military aircraft flew in Egyptian airspace, and up to 45 U.S. Fifth Fleet naval ships passed through the Suez Canal annually. Cutting aid would push Egypt into the hands of anti-Western groups, and neither the United States nor Israel could afford that. Arms sales and financial aid still continue today without interference, although it is no secret that the regime has caused an unsurpassed amount of bloodshed and incredible human rights violations. In hindsight, the United States' position never changed because, quote, although the Arab world received a disproportionate amount of U.S. funding to promote democracy, it received virtually no support to enhance civilian control of the militaries. And this is very important. So where do we go from here? First, the military in Egypt, as in many Middle Eastern countries, has total control of power. Power sharing by civilian institutions, or a balance of power between the military and civilian institutions, is unheard of. This balance has come about in other transitions, especially in Latin America, through the United States interference. The United States Department of Defense Center for Civil-Military Relations has played a vital role in raising political consciousness and providing necessary information for effective civilian control of the armed forces. Second, the military is highly suspicious of civilian involvement in the economy, and their enterprise does not go beyond domestic production. They're not interested in engaging with the global economy, and they have failed miserably in terms of advancing the country economically. Third, I will skip that and I will just jump to my conclusion. So I would like to highlight the following points. First, theoretically, as social scientists, as people in the field who are going through what I call an identity crisis, because there is this trend to generalize, there is this trend to try and pigeonhole cases in grand theory, and this is one of the problems that even on the theoretical level, people are not able to engage with democratic transitions after the Arab Spring. Also, analysts are not linking the domestic level of analysis to the international. For example, post-Arab Spring, Egyptian politics were affected by the political stronghold of the military as well as the foreign policy interests of the United States and its regional ally, Israel. Thirdly, the negligible amount of literature on the agency of political actors in the Arab Spring, which is also linked to the bias in the literature that I addressed earlier in the research, namely the divide between the elites versus the Islamists. The rest of the paper talks about what I call the elitists, not liberals, because they do not fall under the definition of liberals, but for that I have written a chapter in a book called Recognition as Key to Reconciliation, and I will stop here with basically saying or reinstating that democratic transition is they're like wheels and cogs. Everything has to fall in place in order for the machine to work on many levels. Whether we talk domestic level, whether we talk international level, all players have to cooperate in order for the wheels to work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tina. we will move from democratic transitions to democratization in peril, stubborn neoliberalism in Tunisia and the dangers therein, by Colin Powers.
All right. Thanks for having me, first and foremost, and for allowing me to serve as your token leftist up here. I will douse a bit of cynicism on the preceding panel, particularly. The threats to the young, the emergent democracies born of 2010 and 2011's Arab revolts are many. Some, like the Sisi-directed counter-revolution in Egypt or the Saudi-sponsored repression in Bahrain, are rather tactile and unambiguous. The conspicuousness of these actors' methods, as well as the categorical, unclothed discernibility of their motivations and intentions, renders their complicity in authoritarian slippage and revanchist cronyism irrefutable. Little sociological imagination, therefore, is required in interpreting the meaning or effect of Saudi tanks rolling across the King Fahd Causeway, in evaluating how bulldozing of the Pearl Roundabout speaks to democracy's future in the domain of the Khalifa, or in analyzing the massacre at Rabaa, Morsi's imprisonment, or the folly and manipulation of Tamarad. Certainly our understanding of these events can be enriched by historical sociology, by considering class, social theory, and international political economy. That said, a passing glance at a news sheet is sufficient to give some indication of the physical danger that regional actors like the Khaliji Sunni royals and the Egyptian military business elite pose vis-a-vis popular rule and emancipatory politics. That being the case, this talk will turn the focus on to what are perhaps more subtle threats to democracy in the contemporary Middle East. Centering on a case study of the Tunisian transition, I will argue that democratic consolidation in the home of the Jasmine Revolution remains precarious and fragile. Furthermore, I will contend that this precarity is a consequence of the country's experience with liberal democratization. In structuring, regulating, ordering, and disciplining the transition, liberal democratization, a collaborative project jointly engineered by international and domestic actors, has functioned so to do two things. First, borrowing from Peter Mayer, it has hollowed out Tunisia's democracy to a certain degree. Secondly, and importantly, it has excised economic policy making from the remit of both elected officials and popularly accountable majoritarian institutions more generally. The consequences of this are rather profound. To begin, in installing a democracy that is elite managed and non-sovereign, at least vis-a-vis the economy, liberal democratization ensures that the social democratic preferences of the Tunisian electorate are not translated into policy outcomes, severing or weakening the basic linkages that are constitutive of popular rule, those connecting both society to party and society to state, and insulating basic questions regarding the economy from the purview of democratic deliberation. Liberal democratization has unsurprisingly and significantly undermined the perception and the performance of democracy in Tunisia. Moreover, while liberal democratization's hollowing of Tunisian democracy is partially an outcome of the Madisonian and liberal constitutionalist preferences held by its chief authors, the agenda of this democratization project was never self-contained, nor was it hermetically sealed within the domain of politics proper. Rather, as is typical, liberal democratization in Tunisia was equally animated by a neoliberally styled market-making mission. What is more, materially speaking, and as is typical again, Tunisian democratization has assigned economic liberalization ontological priority above its duty to the basic principle that government should be by, for, and of the people. In this sense, then, the hollowing of democracy in Tunisia was undertaken not as a goal in and of itself, but in large part so to ensure the reproduction of economic neoliberalism in the transition period. But therein lies the second threat, imminent to liberal democratization's articulation of democracy. After all, to reintroduce the self-same neoliberal economic policy paradigm in the transition is to reintroduce the very catalysts that drove the Arab Spring revolts in the first place. In this manner, the orchestrated non-reform of the transitional economy has left in place a development model that is structurally incapable of generating growth, job creation, and an equitable distribution of resources. It has left in place the very economy that produced Bouazizi's self-immolation and that drove millions to challenge an autocrat's seemingly eternally grip on power. To put it bluntly, FDI-dependent market capitalism on the global periphery cannot and will not deliver the labor productivity gains, the requisite investment, or the high value-add exports that are needed to power sustainable and equitable economic progress. In an act of tragic, if not unknowing, self-sabotage, then, liberal democratization's devotion to neoliberalism renders Tunisia's new democracy permanently unstable and guarantees that it will be endlessly subverted by social dislocation, unemployment, deprivation, and resentment. Indeed, we need to recognize prior to anything else that the Arab Spring did not represent the Middle East's 1989 moment. Unlike those post-communist transitions that were, to a considerable extent, undertaken in the name of political liberalization, the revolts of 2010 and 2011 were a rather direct reaction against the region's experience with capitalism. This is verified in the principles and slogans around which protests were organized: bread, freedom, dignity, and social justice, in the consistency with which Arab publics, Tunisia included, articulate substantive economic criteria as the most important characteristics of democracy, and in the nature of the collective actions that continue to rock Tunisia today. Rather than fetishize polyarchy or the philosophical merits of liberalism, public opinion data from the Arab Barometer, the World Value Survey, and the Arab Transformation Index makes clear that Tunisians conceptualize, normativize, and evaluate democracy based on outcomes, based on its capacity to deliver material gains and its capacity to protect the social rights of its people. For these publics, the defining attributes of democracy are therefore the welfare state, public employment, inclusive growth, and an equitable distribution of resources. It is thus in the stark contrast between the democracy Tunisians desire and the democracy they have been delivered under liberal democratization, one sacralizing negative liberties and civil and political rights, while excluding positive liberties and social and economic rights, one privileging constitutionalism and proceduralism above participation, that we can best appreciate the challenges facing popular rule in Tunisia today. All of which brings us to Ennahda. Before proceeding further, I should first say that I find many of the traditional debates on Islamism and politics in the Middle East little more than a showcase for Orientalist dog whistling and lazy trope making. In Tunisia's case, the now post-Islamist party has made its commitment to pluralism and representative government explicit and acted on that. As is the case, the argument typically issued forth from secularist Puritans who have themselves spent decades repressing political liberties, that is somehow in fact Ennahda that represents the specter of tyranny, is frankly deserving of derision and scorn. All the same, in so much as Ennahda has become a central contributor to liberal democratization in Tunisia, which indeed they have, I am comfortable critiquing them, not as some existential menace, but as yet another example of a political party enlisted to carry out misguided neoliberal economic reform. Given the outsized importance that early policy decisions have in determining the long-term trajectories of political transition, moreover, Ennahda's initial ascension to power following the fall of Ben Ali means they deserve a special censure in this regard. Of course, the party's decision-making has in many ways been structured and prefigured by circumstance, by their lack of internal economic expertise, by the power imbalances inherent to a debtor nation's negotiations with the international financial institutions, by the prospects of capital flight and credit rating downgrades, and by the knowledge that one misstep would lead to their fate becoming like that of the Ikhwan in Egypt or FIS in Algeria. Nonetheless, without discounting any of that, it is still necessary that the party be held accountable for its role in liberal democratization, as I believe it is that project that does imperil to some degree Tunisia's democratic tomorrow. I am happy to discuss the specific of the party's economic policy making in the Q&A. Given the shortage of time, however, I will just point out that in general, as evidenced both by their performance while in power and following their rehabilitation under the Shahid government, Ennahda has been critical to liberal democratization in 4 distinct ways: in reinstating the neoliberal policy paradigm and honoring the letters of intent that Tunisian governments have signed with the IMF, in consolidating the elite's cartelization of the transitional democracy, in deactivating class as a political cleavage, and in acquiescing to the reintegration of Ben Ali's old capitalist elite. To conclude, I believe that one cannot understand the fragility of Tunisia's political, social, and economic future, as evidenced in the 207 protests and riots recorded between January 1st and March 22nd of this year alone, in the disaffection revealed in public opinion data, and the energy of anti-system political actors, be they Salafist or leftist in nature, or in the declines in voter participation witnessed between 2011 and 2014, apart from the country's experience with liberal democratization. In reproducing and revitalizing economic policies that cannot help generate social dislocation, unemployment, marginality, inequality, and low growth, in disenfranchising revolutionary actors, and in institutionalizing a political praxis that is ineffectual to a certain degree, liberal democratization engenders alienation, apathy, and resentment, all of which may one day come home to roost to disastrous effect. Like with the allegedly mature democracies of the West, Tunisia too must reckon with its economic model, lest it one day find itself under the same siege of populism, nativism, and nihilism that besets Europe and the United States today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to have a final speaker. Tahir Kalabouz will speak, and he has some slides. I think that's already set up. And he will speak on once allies, always allies, how coalition building under authoritarianism shape democratic transitions in MENA region. I'll show you this one.
Yes, hello everyone. We all made to the last presentation of the last panel. It is quite difficult to talk at the end of such a rich conference, but I'll try to do my best to keep you awake for the next 10 minutes. So I'll start, my presentation is actually about where Dr. Abdelkader left off. The necessity of cooperations during times of transition, but I'm trying to look at the roots of those cooperations at the times of transitions in the Middle East and North Africa. First of all, usually we have a misunderstanding between authoritarian breakdowns and democratic transitions. We usually think that authoritarian breakdowns is a democratic transition as well, but we know that most of the time authoritarian breakdowns lead to another authoritarian regime. Not all revolutions lead to democracy. Democracy building is sometimes a different process than toppling a dictator. That is why focusing on the transition processes should be helpful to understand the success and failure of democratic transitions as well. And when we look at the Middle East, even though there are almost transition attempts, the real transition attempts that we saw in the last couple of decades were Algeria in early 1990s and Egypt and Tunisia during the Arab Spring. And my research is mainly about these 3 cases. The literature talked about the importance of cooperation during times of transitions. From 1980s onwards, from Latin American and Eastern European cases, we all talked about the importance of cooperation. Late Al-Stappen talked about cooperation in Tunisian case as well. Yes, cooperation is important, but there are certain problems with the concept of cooperation or our understanding of cooperation as well. Cooperation is a very contingent term. It is intangible. We cannot see, we cannot really detect. It's a fluid term. It is not testable. That is why we have to step back and try to understand cooperation so that we can understand the transition processes as well. We can do 2 things for this. One is unpacking cooperation. So what is cooperation? During the transition times, politicians or political groups, these are rational actors. they interact with other groups, they strategize, and they're dynamic. They sometimes change their positions as well. So this is a dynamic process with strategic calculations, which fits well with the general understanding of game theoretic logic. And this is almost like a game. Different groups try to take out benefits for their interest, and they compromise, they get something, they give something. And transition processes are actually two nested games together. So on the one hand, usually the literature talks about the game between or interaction between opposition actors and regime actors, but actually there are two different interactions, one between different opposition actors and the second is opposition and the regime. In Middle Eastern cases, it is usually first interaction between Islamist and secularist opposition actors, and then we move to the regime after the first interaction. And if there is a cooperation in the first level, it is much more likely for regime to cooperate in the second level. Otherwise, one of the groups in the first level can move to the regime side and try to undermine the process of democratization. The second thing is to understand why actors cooperate. What is their benefit? Sometimes conflict might be more beneficial than cooperation. So they cooperate if they believe that they have more benefit in cooperation and compromise. But the second thing is, they have to be sure that the other side should not leave the table. So the other side is not going to shirk. There should be a commitment from both sides. There should be credible commitment for the continuous cooperation. And that credible commitment is difficult during transition times because it is a new process, rules of the game changes, it is difficult to commit credibly. That is why the process before the transition is very important to establish that credibility for different actors. And the cases in the Arab world show that creating an opposition coalition during the authoritarian time is very helpful to establish this credibility. If different groups come together and establish an ideational opposition coalition under authoritarian regime, then they establish certain properties. First of all, they know each other, they have organizational capital. Second, they establish trust among each other. And finally, they start to have a shared vision among each other. So basically, different actors come together, they create an opposition coalition, they have these properties, trust, shared vision, and capital. When transition attempt comes, that can translate into continued cooperation because they can commit to each other credibly that they are going to cooperate. And when you look at these cases, in Algeria, there was no real strong attempt of opposition coalition before 1990s under authoritarianism. In Egypt, there were several attempts like Kifaya movement or several demonstrations, but it was always on the ground. It was not an ideational movement. So it wasn't really helpful as well. But in Tunisia, there was October 18 collective, which provided the basis for the credible commitment during the process. And I argue that that played a big role in the success of Tunisian transition. I'm not going to talk about Algerian and Egyptian cases here and focus on Tunisian cases to show how this pre-transition affected the post-transition process. So, in Tunisian context, the process started in late 90s, but mainly in early 2000s. In 2003, political actors from different parties and different groups came together in France, in Aix-en-Provence, and they had a 3-day conference. In this conference, you could see so many political figures that later played a very big role in Tunisian transition. In this photo, there is one president, one leader of the parliament, and I should count about, I guess, 5 or 6 ministers of the transition process. And that conference was the first big event that these groups came together. There were several attempts as well, but this was the first one. And in those 2-3 days, they defined 12 points that they should agree upon. So that kind of started a channel for dialogue between different actors. So while this happened abroad, more important step was taken domestically in Tunisia. In late 2005, there was this international summit in Tunis, and opposition actors wanted to take benefit from this, and they decided to organize a hunger strike. 8 people from different movements came together, and they had a hunger strike for 30 days. And you can see them sitting here, the 8 members. Those are from 4 of the main opposition parties in Tunisia and 4 civil society members. And this brought together Islamists, leftists, but socialists, liberals, nationalists, and that was a big splash. After this 30-day hunger strike, the opposition actors discussed how to benefit from this attempt and how to continue this thing. So they decided to establish a collective, which is named October 18 Collective. For the next 4 years, these 8 members plus 5-10 other members from different parties came together regularly, sometimes every month, sometimes every 3 months, because there were regime trying to prevent as well. But they came together regularly and discussed how to build a democratic Tunisia together. So this experience was very important on all of the 3 points that I mentioned. First of all, they got to know each other. They created an organizational and social capital among each other. One of the members of the collective, Ayashi Hamami, says that the relations became deeper. In the personal level, we are friends, even though there are political conflicts. It is correct that even though they are not friends, they all have each other's phone numbers. There are channels of communication. So that creates the first step. The former president, Mousef Marzouki, says that for these activities, they actually established a certain trust among actors. So that was the second point. And the third point was the shared vision. After 4 years of meetings, right, a couple of months before the revolution, they published this book, طريقنا إلى الديمقراطية, Our Path to Democracy. And the subtitle is even more interesting. So it is something like summary of the national dialogue between Islamists, liberals, nationalists, and socialists. It's very telling. A common vision for the establishment of a democratic Tunisia. So they basically agreed upon certain points on pluralism, religion and state, and women's rights. Main points of contention between Islamists and non-Islamists. And they kind of resolved main problems in that process. And it wasn't easy, but they compromised to some extent. So how this process affected the transition later on? There are 3 main points during the transition. The first one I think is more important, is the establishment of the Troika government after the first elections. It was possible for Ennahda, after winning the elections, to find a minor partner and establish a government. Or it was possible for secularist parties to say we are not going to work with Ennahda. But eventually they established this Troika government with 1 Islamist and 2 non-Islamist parties. And when I talked with the leaders of these parties, even though today they disagree on so many things, they agreed on the importance of their past in the establishment of Troika government. Rashid Ghannouchi said we did not have to look for common ideational grounds with the 2 secular parties because we had already overcome the conflicts and found the common grounds for democracy. When we look at Mustafa bin Jafar, the leader of At-Takattul, he said we didn't have to force ourselves to work with Islamists because it was a natural outcome after working with them together for years. And Mousef Marzouki, the leader of CPR, former president, said Aix-en-Provence conference in 2003 was the beginning of the Troika government. So they all pointed out the past that they had under Ben Ali regime that they tried to build at that time. The second point was the completion of constitution. Osama Zaghair mentioned how difficult it was to write the constitution. They were supposed to do it in 1 year, but it was a very difficult process with ups and downs. But the former experience still helped a lot with the completion of the constitution, despite all those problems. Even though civil society entered the game towards the end of the process, the main resolution happened between these parties that met in the past as well. The Dar-Diafa dialogue was very important, which brought together three parties of Troika government and PDP or El Jumhuri, which was part of the October 18 collective and some other parties. And the actors say that 95% of the constitution were resolved in that dialogue process. And the former Minister of Human Rights from Ennahda, Samir Dilo, says that if it was not for the October 18 and the documents written at that time, it would be much more difficult to write the constitution. So it was maybe 2 years, it would take 4 years, 5 years, if it wasn't those agreements in the past. And finally, the third step is the national dialogue process. This is the second level of the game. After the opposition actors agreed upon certain principles, with the participation of the old regime actors, the softliner actors from the old regime accepting the new game, national dialogue process resolved the issues as well. So, to summarize, yes, cooperation is important, but it is not just between opposition and regime, it is also between different opposition actors to provide certain grounds for cooperation with the regime, and it is very important to look at what happened under authoritarianism. Maybe like looking forward, what we can say for the opposition actors in the MENA is it is very important to invest in the future to work by working with other actors. It is usually difficult. It is a very difficult process. Compromises are supposed to be given, but if the success is necessary, probably this is one of the best ways to go. Thank you very much.
To all the speakers, knowing that it was challenging to present your deep thoughts into 10 minutes or 11 minutes. I appreciate you summarizing that, and but it allows us to have Q&A with audience members. So if you have a question, just please raise your hand, and we'll just go around. This person right here, please just
Thank you.
stand. And, yeah.
My question is for Tahir Yavuz. Turk Muslims, I think, right? So yeah, I was very, your game theoretic approach is very interesting. I was wondering if you've taken that model and considered Egypt and its failed transition as a case, and perhaps even Turkey in terms of Turkey's at the consolidation stage stumbling. So how would it work in those cases?
Should I answer right?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, actually I applied to Egyptian case as well. That's one of the cases that I actually work on. In Egypt, we don't see the opposition coalition building as in the Tunisian case before 2011. And when 2011 came, we can see that cooperation between Islamist actors and secularist actors. It is not just the fault of one side, actually both sides are quite unwilling to cooperate. Even though there are attempts like entering the election with a common list or trying to build certain things, it is not a continued strategic interaction. It is just several attempts. So that is why there is a disconnect between Islamist actors and secularist actors in Egypt. And when the regime, when we come to the second interaction with the regime could find allies for themselves against the Islamist actors. So that is why we saw Jabhat al-Inqadh, National Salvation Front, in Egypt, who could work with the regime, or we could see Mohammed Baradei accepting the coup or playing a big role during the coup, because they could not establish the cooperation in the first level. In Turkey, I actually see a similar thing after the coup or military intervention in 1997. So between 1997 and 2002, there are increasing interaction between Islamist actors and some liberal and leftist intellectuals. And I think it played a big role in the early years of AKP. And probably one of the reasons why we're not seeing the same process, that connection was lost. And of course, there are many other reasons, like continuous electoral successes and expansion of power. But I can see the same connection in 1990s.
Thank you. Yes, this question. Microphone behind you.
My question is to the first speaker, Dalia. You have given us excellent survey of the relationship between the United United States and the Egyptian army. But you left us with a question, why the US government seems to take and tolerate all the abuse, and that it forgives every inappropriate behavior but by the Egyptian army. Is that because of, you think, and it is because of the pressure of Israel or the Israeli lobby, or the Saudi, Khaliji lobby, or it is an intellectual rationalization of that relation? Thank you.
I don't think it's any of those things. I think the problem with our policy towards Egypt is that we have confused access with influence. We no longer have influence, what we do have is access. In terms of the way we bill our military aid, $49 billion in 10 years, and it's maintenance of access to the military. We don't influence military behavior. If military aid is supposed to be in US national interest, let's see what's happened in Egypt in the past 2 years. Egypt is becoming on borderline ungovernable. Sinai is insecure and unstable. There's not even projection of power into Sinai. We have no real media, there's no real media telling us what's going on there. So in terms of the way we think about military aid in the United States, it's supposed to be for securing US strategic interest. We have kind of replaced that with simple access rather than influence. We don't influence Egyptian behavior in the region, as is indicated in the past, basically 16 months of Sisi's behavior. And the idea has been, some people write op-eds, well, it's because then they can just go to Russia, right? As if there is an interchangeability in US and Russian military aid. We know how very different they are, right? Military aid is not just in tanks and planes, it's actually in spare parts and training. And so it's not fungible, it can't very quickly go to Russia. And so the language with which we talk about, well, there are other alternatives that Sisi could go to, is also a false way of looking at it. And so it's not clear why why in the United States we are not actually leveraging our power vis-a-vis Egypt. It's not clear why, and I think, so this is actually a longer argument in a chapter, and I think it's because we have actually had an unclear strategy towards Egypt, and it's fluctuated within administrations. And right now, because our State Department has basically been gutted and weakened, we actually have no real clear strategy towards Egypt. I think that's why. Blaming it on other, we usually use the language of, the reason why is we need to maintain these relationships because of the security of Israel. The security of Israel is also in Egypt's strategic interest, right? And so I think we need to move away from those arguments and actually think about why the US has moved away from influence and has simply accepted access.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Anwar Haddam from Algeria. Actually, I have the feeling, just for the last speaker, and also the other might. I think we are, I have the feeling that we are mixing between, or confused between regime reform and regime change. In that sense, I would put Algeria and Turkey in the same side, that regime reform. Back in the 90s, it was not in our mind as elected member of parliament at the time, we were not thinking of regime change, but it was rather a change within the regime. That's why we did not have this issue of coalition. But why we failed, while Turkey somehow succeeded, is that Turkey were able to have that dialogue and that to reshape in civilian-military relations. That we did not succeed in Algeria. And also that will be interesting also for those who are, for the regime change after the Democratic Spring 2011, while in Tunisia, the army was not having that strong position in the states, while in Egypt, it's totally different game. So still the problem is how we internally with our country to reshape military-civilian relations, and how at the international level to convince our partners, our economic partners, that it is for the best interest of everybody to reshape the military-civilian relationship. Thank you.
Yeah, so democratic transition can happen in different ways. It can happen through a revolution after toppling of the dictator, or it can happen through reform process. We see examples of both processes in the history of last century in different regions. Algerian example is definitely a reformed transition. It was through reform. But when I talk about regime change, I talk about establishment of democracy, which is basically establishment of free, fair, and competitive elections and certain guarantees. This was happening in Tunisia, in Algeria, through reforms. And we can call it a regime change or not, but that was still a change within the system through reforms. And I believe that may have affected the coalition building processes. I think that makes sense. But at the end, there was no coalition building, which probably affected the process as well.
He has the mic, and I'll make sure you have it next.
My question is for... It's on, yeah. My question is for Colin. First of all, I'm from Brooklyn, so I really appreciate you getting up there and telling it like it is. Not pulling any punches. But something was bugging me, a couple points I made at the end there. So you mentioned, in the Arab Barometer data that there is this really strong correlation between, how people feel, like what the respondents felt was most important about democracy is that it had these economic outcomes that they were looking for. Isn't that a little problematic though when it comes to normatively what we would want? Because if you link the legitimacy of a political system to the economic outcomes, that far from being, far from staving off populism, that is an engine for populism, right? And historically, that's been the case in the region. So I'd just like to get your thoughts on that and, how you kind of grapple with that.
I'll just piggyback on that because I criticized the study in my paper. The Arab Barometer contradicts itself constantly. If you read the article, it says on one hand it was the economics that pushed those uprisings, and then it says that it was social justice. So it constantly contradicts itself. And I find it very unsettling because we all know out of facts that are on the floor, on the ground, that the reason that, for example, in Egypt, the social movement started is, the uprising started is because Khalid Said and what happened to Khalid Said a year or two before the revolution or the uprising. So we know with the facts on the ground that it wasn't just about economics.
No, I don't think anyone argues it's purely economic, and that's not my intention. I think there's causa proxima and there's causa ultima and everything, and certainly there were an absolute aspiration for political liberty, as you may kind of minimally see it. But I think, Egypt probably had something like 10,000 labor actions between 2003 and 2011. So to exclude basic questions of economy from the grievances that were sort of underlying popular frustration, I don't think that's fair. To your question, yeah, I absolutely agree. It is problematic, but normatively, sure, but I guess I don't decide how people are evaluating democracy. They do that. So it's more a reflection of how, in a lot of transitional democracies especially, there is a immediate pressure to deliver material gains because the performance of the government is read as the performance of democracy writ large. And so in those circumstances, there is a major onus, as I see it, in delivering the kinds of social changes people desire. And that's terribly challenging, and I don't think there's a great deal of help from the West in this regard because they're pushing these economics still, and the IMF talks about inclusive growth today, but if you look through the letters of intent that the Tunisians, the Jordanians, and everyone else has signed with these guys since 2008, there's no difference in policy substance. And so I think that's why there is sort of this dissonance, and in a sense, irresolvable between like a purely liberalist approach to democracy and a social democratic kind of vision. And I think that's just going to create tensions. Now, whether it blows up or anything else, I'm not a soothsayer, but I just think that's there, and it needs to be discussed, and it rarely is.
Question here.
My remark is going to Mr. Tahir. I have the feeling that I know you have listened concerning the Tunisian case only to one part, to one side. It's maybe it's a Nahda version. I think the constitution of 2014 was the result of a compromise, not between Al-Nahda and the two political parties of Troika coalition. It's not true. It was the result of a compromise between the Islamists, represented maybe by Al-Nahda, and the secularists, represented by Nida Tunis. It was not possible to make the constitution only on this basis of the coalition of 18 October. That's not true. I'm not agree, totally not agree with you. I think you are a scholar and you are busy with a very important issue, maybe help to write our historical process, and I think you should be careful and you should listen to the other side of the story. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for this. That is possible that I missed certain aspects, but I don't think I only listened to Nahda. In fact, like Nahda was only a minority of my whole interviews. And about the issue of the constitution, I don't want to undermine the impact of national dialogue or NIDA or Jabha Shabiya on the constitution process. But in fact, like the bulk of the constitution was agreed on Dar Diafa and also in consensus committee. And when I say it is 90% was completed in these processes, it is not someone from Al-Nahda. In fact, Issam Shabi and Mustafa bin Jafar said the same thing. So, yeah, I mean,
You forget the meeting of Paris between the President Sibsi and Sheikh Rashid Al-Ghanouchi. Without this meeting, it was not possible to go on.
Yeah.
We are in Bardo 2 blocks. We were in Bardo 2 blocks.
Yeah. So that is actually the part that I had to go a bit quickly, the national dialogue process, which is the third important step. And I think that is the part that the role of NIDA becomes even more important. But consensus committee was founded and worked in May, June, and July. That meeting was in August. I think that was very important to resolve the gridlock and move forward, but not specifically on the constitution. So that is why I say for constitution, it was still among the opposition. But in order to move from the gridlock, complete the transition process, go to the second elections and ratification of constitution, that is correct. It is the August meeting, it is the agreements between Rashid Ghanouchi and Beji Csid Sibsi, and also the role of the quartet as well. So for that, I agree with that.
Thank you, thank you. I think we can have a consensus. This is a very great panel on many different aspects of democracy and its difficulties of transition. And a round of applause to our presenters. And I will give the panel back to Wadwan Masmoudi in closing of the program. Thank you again.
Thank you, Qamar Huda, and all the panelists. Thank you, all of you, for staying until the end. I know it was a long day, So I will not speak for more than 1 or 2 minutes, just to say that the struggle for democracy continues. It's a long path. We are learning, but we are learning even in the United States, which is probably the oldest democracy in the world. The struggle for democracy in the United States also continues. So it's not an ending process. There is no end to the struggle for democracy. And so we are learning, and we remain, inshallah, optimistic that we will learn from our mistakes and also from the mistakes of others, and that we will remain optimistic despite all these challenges. So at the end, I want to thank Nader and Asma for their help in putting the program together. I want to thank Munji and Leila and Mahdi for their help in the logistics and the registration. I want to thank all the speakers, especially those who came from Tunis, Khalid and Osama. I know it was not easy, so thank you very much for coming and for joining us. And we look forward to continuing to work together, inshallah, for a better future for the Middle East and North Africa, but also for the whole Islamic world and the whole world in general. And I think democracy is the only way forward, but sometimes we forget. So we have to remind ourselves that the alternative to democracy is much worse. It's not easy, but the alternative is much worse and much more difficult. So thank you all very much, and we look forward to seeing you at future events. And please do come and visit us in Tunisia, inshallah.
I didn't want to meet the